joint work with Heskey and Justin. And, you know, thanks to Massimo and Igor, actually, I don't have to provide any introduction into, you know, what is acquihiring. And so let's just, you know, so the way I view sort of Igor's paper is, at the end of the day, acquihiring in his paper is still about the product market. It's about foreclosure in the product market, in an inefficiency rising because, you know, of some friction, which is here that actually the firms, the potential acquirers, don't arrive at the same time. And so an inefficient acquirer might, you know, sort of, you know, the aim of foreclosing its rival might hire the worker, although, you know, the entrepreneur, although the later firm that arrives later actually might be, you know, more efficiently employ the entrepreneur. So what, you know, Heskey, Justin, and I in this paper are doing is we're actually, in a sense, taking, you know, Mark Zuckerberg and, you know, and the tech companies even more at their face value, in that we're saying it's nothing to do with the product market, okay? It's all about the labor market. And then the question, you know, is, you know, might there still be some inefficiency? Good. Okay, so I can, you know, okay, so, and you know, ultimately, you know, what this paper is about, trying to explain the puzzle, you know, if you're really just interested in labor, you know, why do you buy the entire company? Why not just the labor you're interested in? So here, you know, our answer is it's going to be acquihiring for monopsony power. That what acquihiring does is it removes the main labor market competitor, namely the startup, and so allows the acquirer to hire at lower wages, okay? And so it's really a story about very thin, specialized labor markets as opposed to concentrated product markets. And as you're going to see, an inefficiency can arise even if there's no product market effect. Of course, the question is still, so I told you, you know, because of, you know, what you're going to do is you want to become a monopsonist, so as to that you can then hire the employee or the worker more cheaply. But, you know, in order to do so, you have first to buy the company. So you have to pay the venture capitalist or whoever else, you know, owns the startup. And so why actually does it end up to be cheaper than direct hiring? And, you know, at the heart of what I'm going to tell you today is that there are two stories. The first is that acquihiring does not require that the acquirer compensates the employee for the loss of her private benefit, which she gets at the startup, but not at the acquirer. And the second story will be that the potential for intense competition between the acquirer and the startup for the employee is going to reduce the acquisition price of the startup, and so allows the acquirer to buy the startup at a much lower price, as you're going to see. Okay, so, and you know, the way we want to do is, you're going to see it's a really kind of pretty lowbrow, you know, sort of and very simple. So we're going to do this in a series of related model. In the baseline, you know, it's just going to focus on, in a sense, the acquirer and the startup colluding against the worker, so as to essentially extract his private benefits. It's super simple. It's get some notation up. And above all, it's going to make you curious about all sorts of unrealistic assumptions. And then I'm going to move to a richer model, which has this baseline model just as a special case, which has more general bargaining, but moreover, more importantly, really, you know, allows, you know, for this idea that there's going to be a threat of a battle for talent. And, you know, then we can ask, you know, whether in this baseline model, actually, as you're going to see, the acquirer always wants to acquihire, will never want to hire directly. Here now, sometimes actually, you know, in equilibrium, it would happen that direct hiring happens and sometimes acquihiring, and sort of, you know, try to understand when will we have what. And the mechanism is going to highlight a certain asymmetry between the big acquirer, the big firm, big tech, and the little startup. And then depending on time, I might talk about yet another model about, where we have uncertainty or private information about private benefits, which is providing us with a natural reason why actually even in the baseline, these private benefits could not be fully extracted by the startup. And then we have some additional extensions, with multiple workers and so on, which may be independent or complementary and so on. But I guess given how slow I typically am in talking, I'm probably not going to talk about that. Anyway, so let's start with the baseline model, which is all about private benefits, okay? And gets up the notation. So going to be 3 players, an employee E, who's essential for the startup, startup S, which generates VS when the employee works there. So when I think startup, you might also think VC, venture capital, if you like, with control rights in the firm. And then there's an acquirer A or big tech, who could generate VA from this employee. Okay, so there's going to be, wages, W, and they're going to be obviously endogenous. And there's a lower bound on wages, W lower bar. I'm going to talk more about this later. And if the wage is above W lower bar, then indeed the employee enjoys a benefit B while working at the startup. So think about, this private benefit maybe having to do with, workers, employees being, identifying with the mission of the startup, okay, for instance, okay? But we still assume that this private benefit, this W lower bar, they're not too large relative to the productive values of the employee at the acquirer and the startup. Importantly, so the acquirer can choose between direct hiring and acquihiring. So you decide, so A, so it's a very simple, game where the acquirer first decides whether to engage in direct hiring, acquihiring. If he chooses direct hiring, then actually we're going to have, which we didn't have, in Igor's paper, we're going to have essentially an auction for the worker, A and S simultaneously making wage offers, WA and WS, and the employee then deciding which offer to accept, if any. And then, if instead the acquirer at stage 1 decided to engage in acquihiring, then the acquirer makes a bid to buy the startup. And if that bid is accepted, well, then now A would, now still has to make sure that the employee works for him. So going to make a wage offer WA. If the bid was rejected, then the startup, which wasn't bought, is then going to make a wage offer WA to the worker. So let's, it's very simple. So let's begin with the subgame where the acquirer has chosen to engage in direct hiring. So as we already said, there's going to be, a first price auction for the worker. And that the outcome of that auction is going to be efficient, right? Then whenever the value of the, so why is that? Because, for the employee to go to the acquirer means that the acquirer has to pay at least B, the private benefit, more than the startup, okay? And since the startup is willing to bid up to his entire value, VS, and the acquirer is willing to bid up to his value, VA, then we're going to get, of course, that whenever V exceeds VS plus B, then the acquirer is going to be successful. It's going to hire the employee at the wage, which is equal to the equilibrium bid of the startup, which is VS, plus the private benefit B. I mean, sort of looking here at equilibrium and undominated strategies, right? And if instead VA is less than VS plus B, well, then the startup is going to retain the worker at the wage, which is equal to the bid of the acquirer minus the private benefit. And of course, this is efficient. Okay. So what if instead the acquirer chooses acquihiring, okay, and so therefore makes a bid for the startup? Let's think about it. So how much, if the startup were to reject the bid, what would be the continuation value of the startup? Well, then the startup would have would be a monopsonist vis-a-vis the worker and would just pay him W lower bar, right? So his value, the startup's value from rejecting the offer is VS minus W lower bar, okay? What is the acquirer's value if he succeeds in buying, you know, sort of the gross value? Well, it would be VA minus W lower bar, because he also would then just offer W lower bar as a wage. Okay, sorry, I'm jumping here. So therefore, actually, what's going to happen in equilibrium just depends on VA, whether VA or VS is larger. If VA is larger than VS, then the acquirer is going to just offer, makes a bid of VS minus W lower bar, and that is going to be accepted, and then the employee is hired by the acquirer at a wage W lower bar. If instead, VA is less than VS, then the equilibrium offer is going to be rejected, and still the resulting wage for the employee is W lower bar. Okay, so whenever the offer is rejected, actually, then it's actually efficient because of the existence of this private benefit. That's always efficient. But when acquihiring happens here, when it's successful, which it will be when VA is larger than VS, but if that difference isn't too large, namely if smaller than B, the private benefit, then actually this acquisition is inefficient. Okay, so direct hiring, if it were to happen, would be always efficient. Acquihiring, if it were to happen, can be inefficient. Of course, the question now is what will actually happen in equilibrium? Well, it's easy to see that it's always going to happen through acquihiring. So if the employee is hired by the acquirer, then it will happen through acquihiring, not through direct hiring. And of course, the employee, however, he would rather prefer being hired through direct hiring, right? He likes, of course, the competition for himself, and through acquihiring, he's going to lose his private benefit B. So, and the reason, of course, here why in equilibrium acquihiring happens is that the acquirer does not have to compensate the employee for the loss of her private benefit. And in a sense, in terms of course, you might ask, why, how come that this inefficiency arises here? Well, in a sense, of course, it's sort of baked into some assumption here, has to do with the fact that the employee cannot promise here the startup to work at a wage that is below W lower bar, right? So if that were the case, if you would, if the private benefit, if you would still obtain a private benefit even at lower wages, okay, the wages below W lower bar, and if you could somehow promise to work at a wage below W lower bar, namely up to wage to W lower bar minus B, right, then actually this inefficiency here wouldn't arise. Okay, so it has to do with this, but we're going to come, because I'm going to tell you later, of course, that's not important really. I mean, what is important somehow is that this private benefit cannot be fully extracted by the startup. I should say, in fact, Igor mentioned very briefly at the beginning of his talk some empirical literature on acquihiring, and there this empirical literature looks at how employees, or tech workers and others that move to other companies, how the long they're going to stay, depending on whether they were hired directly, which sometimes called it as matched hires, versus whether they were actually hired through an acquisition. Okay, and it turns out actually if they're hired from acquisition, they tend to stay less long at the new employer. Okay, somehow suggesting they're perhaps not that happy than they were perhaps at the initial, or at least certainly not that happy compared to matched workers. Okay, and so now this discussion, of course, what I've just said in terms of mechanism suggests that acquihiring rests on A, private benefits, and B, that there's some lower bound on wages. But neither is key. But first, just to see that private benefits can be very important. Here just, some articles, about WhatsApp. In fact, two co-founders here, Jan Koum and Brian Acton. As you know, WhatsApp was bought by Meta or by Facebook, and actually these co-founders were still working for Facebook, at huge salaries. But when Facebook acquired WhatsApp, they changed privacy policies, and these former founders were very unhappy about this. They had a mission, and they said, no, we don't want to stay with Facebook, and left. And as this Forbes article makes clear, Brian Acton was willing to leave a lot of money behind, $850 million. Unhappy with Facebook's policies. Okay. Now, here's a perhaps not very good story on the lower bound for wages. We're going to provide you, more later. Is it could be the case that this W lower bound reflects some outside option for the work at the time of hiring. Then B, so the private benefit is sort of learned on the job, and then there's some downward wage rigidity. But let's rather move on to the next model. It's a model of general bargaining where the threat of a battle for talent is going to drive down the acquisition price. Okay, so all I'm going to do is make very simple changes. First, I'm going to assume that there's some Nash bargaining or some other efficient bargaining. If the acquirer chooses to engage in acquihiring, so then there's going to be bargaining between the acquirer and the startup, with the acquirer's bargaining power parameter being alpha. And the other and more important change is that we're going to say here, if acquihiring fails, then the acquirer still has a chance to engage in direct hiring. And that happens with probability delta. So delta's probability of then, after failed acquihires to still, being able to engage in direct hiring, or you could think about it as some discount factor if you want. So let's just, in order to get the intuition here, let's just look at bargaining over the acquisition price if this delta, discount factor probability, is equal to 1, one special case. By the way, the baseline model is just a special case of this, right? When A has all of the bargaining, also alpha is equal to 1 and delta is equal to 0. So now let's think about here what would happen if delta is equal to 1. And suppose the acquirer gets to compete now direct, there's a failed acquisition and the acquirer gets to compete directly. So that means that, now thinking about at the takeover stage, at the acquihiring stage, if the startup were to turn down the offer, he would actually earn nothing if then subsequently the acquirer is going to hire the worker directly. And that's going to happen if VA is larger than VS plus B. And if that doesn't happen, right, so then the acquisition would be successful. Sorry, not the acquisition, the direct hiring wouldn't be successful. So the startup would retain the worker, but at quite a high price. And because the acquirer would be willing to bid VA. And so that means that he's going to earn, or the startup in the continuation game would earn VS minus VA plus B. Okay. In either case here, that's less than VS minus W lower bar, which is the profit after failed acquisition in our baseline model. Okay. So it's the threat of battle for talent is going to reduce here the continuation value for the startup if you were to turn down the offer. And so that, and of course, that means, the acquisition price will be lower because the continuation, if S declines, he is going to get a lower payoff. And so that also means that the inefficiency here can arise even without any private benefit. Okay. So if VA is less than VS and B is equal to 0, so that means actually here there's no private benefit. The employee is clearly more productive at the startup than at the acquirer. So it would be efficient for acquihiring to fail. And yet, acquihiring can happen as long as VA is larger than half VS. Okay, so if VA is between a half VA and VA, actually acquihiring is going to happen and yet be inefficient. And so this proposition here is going to summarize, what's going to happen. So what's going to happen here in equilibrium depends on certain parameters. This, when alpha and delta, the product is between 0 and 1. And then there's going to be some VA upper bar and some VA lower bar. The VA upper bar is larger than VS plus B. And the VA lower bar is less than VS. And so what's going to happen is whenever VA is above VA upper bar, actually now still direct hiring is going to happen. The reason here why direct hiring might still happen, but VA is sufficiently large, has to do with the fact that VA is only finite here if alpha, this is the bargaining power of the acquirer, is less than 1. Okay, so if the acquirer doesn't have all of the bargaining power, then actually it might be still when his value is very high, it might still be better to engage in direct hiring because acquihiring would just be very expensive. Okay. But if VA is between this VA upper bar and VA lower bar, then actually, in equilibrium, what we're going to see is acquihiring. And if VA is less than VA lower bar, there's going to be no hiring. Right? Importantly, of course, is VA lower bar is less than VS, as I already mentioned for the special case of delta equals 1. In general, for any delta positive, that's going to be the case here. So there's always going to be a range that even when there's no private benefit, acquihiring is inefficient or can, yeah. Sorry. So this is, so in terms of lessons, here is the first lesson. Sometimes we're going to have direct hiring. Private benefits are not key, for acquihiring to rise. We have here a different mechanism. Of course, the original mechanism is still there if B is positive, but we also now have a second mechanism, so that which is this, that the acquisition price is lower by threat of competition. And as this threat of competition becomes larger, so as delta goes to 1, in the limit, any hiring must be acquihiring. We still have, of course, we haven't changed at all how we model direct hiring. So when direct hiring occurs, it is still efficient, whereas acquihiring can be inefficient. And it's still the case, of course, that the employee is unhappy with the acquihiring, even if he has no private benefit. Before, it was all just about the loss of private benefit. Well, not just all, no, actually not quite right what I'm saying. Yeah, forget what I just said. So but the employee is still unhappy with the acquihiring, but that's still the case even if there's no private benefit, because of course he would rather like to have competition for himself, right? And now the inefficiency here, in a sense, arises because there is an asymmetry between the startup and the acquirer. Namely, the acquirer can buy the startup, but not vice versa. And absent illegal behavior, which of course we know has occurred, it's hard to pay the competitor not to compete. By the way, for that, how much time do I have? 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm doing not that badly, actually. So let me just to, in terms of this has happened, because of course the first slide I didn't show you, it's kind of nice. Here is some email exchange between Eric Schmidt and Steve Jobs. And where essentially, the story was that, Google had, tried to poach some Apple employee, and Steve Jobs wrote to Eric Schmidt saying that he was a bit unhappy about this, and then Eric Schmidt essentially, apologizing to Steve Jobs and saying, also telling him, so first of all, that of course this is going to be this is never going to happen again, and also forwarding here information, from the guy from Google recruiting to Eric Schmidt, saying that this Google employee who tried to poach the employee was terminated within the hour. And in general, they have a very clear do not call policy that's given to every staffing professional. And, okay, of course, he does say, this Google recruiter says to Eric Schmidt that sometimes, errors happen. Someone makes an error in judgment. And for this type of violation, we terminate their relationship with Google, okay? So it's clear, so there was a time when there was a clear no-compete agreement between the big techs, for which then the big tech companies, were later fined hundreds of millions of dollars. But of course, these big tech companies did, of course, engage in acquihiring and direct hiring as well of, in small startups. It was just amongst the big tech companies themselves that they had this policy. Okay, now, in the baseline model, I had that this private benefit, the startup couldn't fully somehow, could not, it wasn't possible to extract, he couldn't extract directly the private benefit from the employee, and there was a lower bound on wages. And that isn't really key for anything, and one way to do this is to introduce here private information or uncertainty. So if, the value of this private benefit is private information, then as you're going to see, so of course, so that's what we're going to, look at. And that, of course, is not directly affecting acquihiring, right? Because the private benefit, not directly plays a role there. But for direct hiring, of course, that's going to play a role, because, how much I have to bid as the acquirer to poach the employee, or a startup, to retain the employee, does depend on, how large this private benefit is. And so what this asymmetric information, this private information now does, is that it softens wage competition. It's a bit like differentiated goods, also somehow soften competition. And the effect in this, we go back to the baseline and just introduce this. The effect of this would now be that also in the baseline, direct hiring can arise. And also, and now for the first time here in this, direct hiring is not necessarily efficient, okay? It can be inefficient. Also means we don't need a lower bound on wages here, and yeah, so as you're going to see. So suppose, to make it simple, suppose that there's a prior that B is uniformly distributed on the interval 0 to capital B. There's no limit on wages, so W lower bar is equal to minus infinity, but there's some outside option normalized to 0. So, there's some other labor market there, okay? Which, of course, what this would mean is that an employee with private benefit B would join the startup only if the wage that the startup offers is larger than minus B. Now, it's convenient to assume that here, to make the math a little bit simpler, to the difference between VA and VS not too large. So we assume that VA is larger than VS minus B, but smaller than VS plus 2B. And capital B not being too large. Okay. And what this B, capital B less than VS, for instance, ensures here is that if the startup becomes a monopsonist vis-a-vis the employee, what he wants to do is he wants to hire the employee with probability 1. And so therefore in order to ensure, set a wage of 0. Okay, so that's optimal then to do. In the, for instance, in the case of a failed acquihire, so where the startup retains the worker, then, in this ensuing sub-game, the wage would be 0 and the worker will for sure stay at the startup. And a successful acquisition here will be at an acquisition price VS and give a profit of V minus V. Yeah, so that of course is different because now the wage is no longer this W lower bar, now it's 0, right? The acquirer would do exactly the same if acquihiring is successful. And so if acquihiring is successful, it would happen at a price PS because VS, because that's the value of the startup, and it's going to then provide a profit of VA minus VS. Okay. And so the numbers are not important. What's here going to be in equilibrium? Yeah, thank you. The wage offers. So important thing here is that in both cases, because of this softening of competition, because of private information, the wage offer of the acquirer is going to be less. He's always going to offer less than VA, and WS is always going to be less than VS. And so there's always going to be an interior probability that the acquirer's offer here under direct hiring is accepted. Okay. And so direct hiring here can be inefficient because sorry, this is actually a typo here. Direct hiring would be efficient if VA minus VS is larger, so if the difference in values is larger than V. But it's going to occur whenever the difference in wages is larger than V. Okay. And as you can easily check here that WA minus WS is not equal to VA minus VS. And in fact, you can easily see here that this success probability can be socially too high or too low. Okay. There can be too little or too much direct hiring, if the acquirer were to choose direct hiring. And here the acquirer will still engage in acquihiring when its VA, when its value is above some threshold, which now is larger than VS, but it's less than VS plus capital V, and engages in direct hiring otherwise. So another thing to notice here is that although I said direct hiring, can be inefficient, or in fact, often is inefficient when chosen, but whenever it is chosen, it is still more efficient than acquihiring. And what you can show is that when this difference in variations relative to capital B is larger than this number here, which means that acquihiring does occur. But if that ratio is less than some larger number, then actually it would be better, socially more efficient for direct hiring to occur. Okay, so we still get similar to the baseline, this sort of range where acquihiring occurs, but it's inefficient. Okay, I don't have much time. Just to say we have do a number of other things, like multiple worker. And actually, we do this in two different ways. One where kind of workers, the multiple workers, and they provide independent values. So they could be hired. I could hire just some workers that don't necessarily need then, and that sort of just is now might mean that actually the acquirer might not necessarily want to engage in acquihiring if he needs only a subset of the workers actually of the startup. Another thing we ask, what's going to happen if these workers are somewhat complementary? Thank you. And then we're going to show that, under direct hiring, what you would want to do as an acquirer is sort of do a divide and conquer strategy and so on. But ultimately, the story is not going to change. And so let me, given that I'm out of time, let me just wrap up. What we have done here is we provide two stories as to why acquihiring, why big tech might engage in acquihiring rather than direct hiring. Namely, the first is you just don't need to compensate the employee for the loss of a private benefit. And the second is that intense competition for talent is going to reduce the acquisition price and therefore make acquihiring cheaper. Acquihiring harms employees and also leads to inefficiencies. So even, sort of this, big tech justification, this is about labor. Even if there's no, you know, unlike in Igor's work, you know, even if there's no, you know, foreclosure motive, there's no product market competition, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it's efficient, you know. So this should come with further discussion. And here's the haiku summary. Thank you.